Vernon SMITH needs no introduction, but I will give one anyway. Founder and a leading figure in behavioral and experimental economics, Smith deservedly won the Sveriges Riksbank Prize in Economic Science in memory of Alfred Nobel in 2002, along with Daniel Kahneman. But he is perhaps best known as a member of the Faculty of Economics at UMass Amherst from 1968 to 72. We lost that one. Today, drawing on the book that Adam Smith himself regarded as his most important work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith will explain why economists should view people as members of communities rather than as narrowly self-regarding actors. And so I will give you Professor Vernon SMITH. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and it really is a great pleasure to be part of this history of economic thought symposium. You know, if I hadn't gone to the University of Kansas and gotten a master's degree, I would have never studied the history of economic thought, because I am the last of the generation that studied it. And by the time when I got to Harvard, it was no longer, it was offered as an elective. So I took it at the University of Kansas, and there I had a really great, eminent scholar of the marginal utility revolution. His name was Richard Howey. And those of you who are au courant on the history of economic thought will recognize Howey's name. Well, he was my teacher there. Well, this talk, in addition to the theory of moral sentiments, I'm also going to deal with markets and the wealth of nations, and to some extent the connection between these two great works by Adam Smith. And I want to emphasize that this is joint work. The work on drawing on a theory of moral sentiments is joint with Bart Wilson, and we have this book on humanomics that I'm drawing on. And then the second part of this talk, which is dealing with markets, is based upon my a book that I have in process with Sabiu Inouye. Sabiu I met about 3 years ago when he wrote me. And he wrote me and said, "You might be interested in the attached manuscript," he said. He says, "You know what you did with your first experiments? You rediscovered classical economics." Well, of course, I would never have put it that way, but I read his manuscript and he was right. It's very much, I was very much following in the tradition of book 1, chapter 7 of the Wealth of Nations, and I once read that but forgot everything I knew about that, so that I was not aware of this very close relationship. All right. So I'm going to do these two things. First has to do with Adam Smith's social theory, and second, what Sabiu and I call his market price discovery theory. And both of these contributions are unique to Adam Smith. I want to repeat that. They're unique to Adam Smith. They have no modern parallel. So if you want to get this from the horse's mouth, you read Adam Smith. Okay, and I'm also going to talk about what I consider to be, and Sabiu and I consider to be, the flaws in neoclassical modern theory, and that those flaws were avoided by the classics, beginning with Adam Smith and down through his English, French, and Italian followers. Well, I want to emphasize two things. And if you don't get anything else out of this talk, I hope you get these two. And the first is that in the theory of moral sentiments, Adam Smith has a model of other regarding behavior, other regarding action by individuals. He models them as regularly and routinely taking into account others. Yet he assumes everybody is strictly self-interested. So now the key to understanding how Smith gets this is to recognize that he distinguishes between being self-interested and choosing to act self-interestedly. That's a very important distinction, you see, that Adam Smith makes in the theory of moral sentiments that we basically don't do today. See, we now say if you prefer A to B, it's because the utility of A is greater than B. And that's typically an if and only if statement. In other words, A preferred to B or chosen over B, if and only if the utility of A is greater than B. Well, it's the only if part which is challenged by Smith. He has a completely different, a non-utilitarian model of preferences. And then in The Wealth of Nations, Smith modeled price formation, price discovery by modeling the buyers and sellers in the markets. In the market, that's not what we do today. What we do is model our representation of an optimal actor in markets, and that's different than what Smith did. He did the right thing, of course, if you're interested in founding a science. Is you begin very close to observation. Okay, so there are these two unique approaches that are distinct from the way we approach it today. But in these cases, you see, Smith always in both books, he's talking about the roots of action in people, or the roots or origins of actions. Then once he gets that straight and he's got the model, then he talks about the consequences. He models the consequences. Today we see those as indistinguishable. The roots are the consequences. That is, we choose the way we do because of the consequences. So Smith's model is far richer. Okay, now how does in TMS, how do self-interested ordinary people learn self-command, what he calls self-command? I love that word. And to follow rules enabling us to live with our neighbors. Well, Smith argues that the very young child has no self-command. Parents tend to intervene mainly to ensure the child's safety, but they don't do anything like the conditioning that starts to occur when we first have playfellows. And he says that when we first have playfellows, the child soon finds that they have no such indulgent partiality as our parents. And generally, to avoid their hatred or contempt, the child learns to moderate its passion to the degree which its playfellows and companions are likely to be pleased with. So that's his approach. And Smith puts it, and this section is absolutely beautiful. Smith says, thus the child, quote, enters the great school of self-command. It studies, and by that he means it learns, because it's not that necessarily aware of what it's studying. It learns to be more and more master of itself and begins to exercise over its own feelings a discipline which the practice of the longest life is very seldom sufficient to bring to complete perfection. And that idea that we constantly do better at this as we get older is documented in experiments. Jurgen and Kirschler have these experiments in which they look at trust and trustworthiness responses in the trust game for children of age 12, 16, then 22, 32, and they run it up to people that are 68. And on average, both trust and trustworthiness is increased across those different age groups. Okay, here's the baseline trust game that I want to talk about, and the numbers here in the movement, and the blue numbers are as dollars for that one earns, and the orange are dollars earned by two. And so, as you know, the standard analysis is that one would never play down if both 1 and 2 are strictly self-interested, because if one plays down, 2 will play down. And because $42 is bigger than $30, and 1 only gets $6 rather than $12 if 1 plays right. So that's the prediction. Now notice that everyone who looks at this game does the same analysis, and implicitly everybody assumes in analyzing the game that people are strictly self-interested, which means you see that 1 doesn't play down because 2 takes a hurtful action, you see, to give 2 less. So we all tend to you see, if you believe that people were other regarding, had utility functions defined over both payoffs, then you would not be able, you wouldn't analyze the game in this way. So, but the mere fact that people look at these games and tend to analyze them in the same way tells you right away that we all of us assume that people are strictly self-interested. Okay, here's the results for 49 pairs from this trust game. You see, we have what we have here is slightly more than half of the ones are playing down, and at a ratio of 2 to 1, the second movers are responding with the cooperative action. So the standard self-interest model here fails, but there's a proposition in the theory of moral sentiments which explains why you might get these results, both in terms of 1's playing down and 2's responding the way they do. We call it, Bart Wilson and I call it beneficence proposition 1. And it says that, and by the way, these are unnumbered, they're not numbered, they're not called propositions in Adam Smith. He just simply states them. And when Smith makes a very articulate statement like this, it's fairly, that has a lot of economy to it. There's not a lot of extra words in it. You want to read that again. That's a proposition, and that has predictive consequences. Okay, in this, he says that actions of a beneficent tendency, which proceed from proper motives, and by that he means intentional. He discusses that at great length, seem alone to require reward because such alone are the approved objects of gratitude. Okay, now these results, this model predicts that the 2's will respond predominantly in a cooperative way, and they do it out of gratitude. So these results are consistent with this calculus of gratitude and self-command that we find in Adam Smith. Now notice though that because people are randomly assigned to position 1 or 2, we can conclude that if the ones were in position 2, they would do the same thing that the 2s they're matched with do. In other words, they would on average 2/3 of them respond cooperatively. Well, but fewer of them, less than 2/3 of the ones offer cooperation by playing down. Well, we can infer that is because ones are uncertain as to the type that they are paired with. 2s know for sure the type they're paired with because ones have passed to them, so they know that ones are offering cooperation. And it's the neat thing about, you'll see, Smith's model is it enables an interpretation of all actions. You see, it's a rich model. It can enable you to ask, well, why don't more than 2/3 of the 2s play right? Why not more ones not offer cooperation? Well, this suggests ways of varying the payoffs, you see, and when you vary the payoffs, you are tempting people to act in their self-interest. You see, that self-command may fail simply because it's too costly to proceed to apply it in a particular case. So it's really a very rich model. Okay, now how do we know that intentions matter? And in particular, it's important, if intentions are a matter, it's important to see not only what the person's action was, but also what the consequences would be if they did not take that action. So you need to see both the payoffs for acting and for not acting. And so this is exactly what we do here in what we call the comparison of the voluntary and involuntary trust game. Kevin McCabe and I did these experiments a long time ago, back in we originally started doing them in the 1990s, although it was published a little later than that. And you can see in the game on the left, which has the same structure as our baseline, except we have made the payoffs a little less severe because we wanted to do a trust game where we'd get lots of people offering to cooperate, and that worked. You see, we're getting here 17 of 27 of the ones playing down. But we're getting approximately the 2-to-1 in favor of cooperation. Whereas, look at the game on the right. One has to pay down. There's no opportunity cost signal. There's nothing given up. And seeing that nothing is given up, what do the 2s do? They defect at the ratio of 2-to-1. It's just the opposite of the game on the left. So this was our first exercise in establishing, you see, that it was important for people and especially in applying these propositions from Adam Smith, that they see the consequences of both the action that was taken and the action not taken. Okay, there's 2 pillars of society in TMS. One is beneficence, as we have indicated in beneficence proposition 1. The other is justice. And here's justice proposition 1, which is just the obverse of beneficence proposition 1. Actions of a hurtful tendency which proceed from improper motives seem alone to deserve punishment because such alone are the approved objects of resentment. So he's giving us the feelings here that are behind this propensity to punish hurtful actions that are deliberately taken by others. So how do we test that? Well, we just do a variation on the original baseline game and allow now if two if one plays down and two defects, play passes back to one. And this is the game on the right. Okay. And comparing it with the original baseline game that I showed you earlier, we can see that indeed we've got 24% of the ones punishing the move down by 2. But also notes that people, the individuals are reading each other somewhat differently than we might expect. You see here, we're getting now, comparing the game on the right here with the one on the left, we're now having 13 percentage points more of ones moving down. Well, you can infer that they're moving down more often in this case because they figure that because they can come back and punish 2, more 2s will cooperate. Notice that there's some slippage here. The ones are misreading the 2s. And in fact, what we have is more 2s moving down. It moves from 33% to 45% moving down. So you see, that's rich in new testable implications because it suggests that the subjects are not reading each other in the same way when there's this possibility of punishment as they read each other when there's not that possibility. So this invites, you see, more experiments that manipulate the payoffs here to try to understand that better. Okay, what are the conclusions? Well, first, trust games in which individuals do not choose best for themselves, collectively do best for the pair. So all are made better off in this instance because people are not choosing in a self-interested way. And also, we see that costly options are invoked to punish injustice. And also, thirdly, we notice that subjects sometimes, sorry for the misspelled word here, fail to read each other. Each other's moves as predicted. Okay, now, what does Smith do with Justice Proposition 1? He sees it as the origin of property rights. You see, he sees it in the punishment in proportion to resentment, you see, explains when we have governments and rule of law, it explains why it is governments adopt these particular laws that they do. The reason is that by the time government comes along, people are long practiced in applying these kinds of rules among their neighbors in ordinary day-to-day interaction. And he, moreover, he argues that the violation of justice is injury, real and positive, to persons from motives naturally disapproved of. It is therefore the proper object of resentment. And also, he says that the greater and more irreparable evil that is done, the resentment of the sufferer runs naturally the higher. So he predicts, you see here, an intensity effect. Now, it's interesting. He takes this, he combines this proposition with another result in the theory of moral sentiments, the asymmetry of gains and losses, to explain why theft and robbery are penalized more than violation of contract. Well, and what's the asymmetry between gains and losses? Well, we of course we've known that for some time from the work of modern psychologists, particularly economic psychologists. But what I want to draw your attention to is the sort of big picture results that Smith gets out of that. And by the way, he's got the world's most economical sort of statement of the asymmetry between gains and losses. He simply says we suffer more when we fall from a better to a worse situation than we ever gain when we rise from a worse to a better. Security, therefore, is the first and principal object of prudence. Okay, and then he goes on to say that to be deprived of that which we are possessed of is a greater evil than to be disappointed of what we have only the expectations. Breach of property, therefore, theft and robbery, which take from us what we are possessed of, are greater crimes than breach of contract, which only disappoints us of what we expected. So get that difference. You see, theft and robbery are more serious than violation of contract because the one takes from us what we already have. The other only frustrates our expectation of gain, and he makes that distinction. He summarizes. He says, the most sacred laws of justice, therefore, those whose violation seems to call loudest for vengeance and punishment, are the laws which guard the life and person of our neighbor. The next are those which guard his property and possessions. Last of all come those which guard what are called his personal rights, or what is due him from the promises of others. Okay, I want now to move into part 2 of the talk and deal with price discovery in the Wealth of Nations. And I'm going to give you a mathematical formulation that comes directly out of Book 1, Chapter 7 of the Wealth of Nations, which turns out to have been predictive of my first experiments, although I was unaware of this at the time. Okay, in Smith, goods have value in use, they have value in exchange. Value in use is measured by willingness to pay, and as the followers of Adam Smith, particularly the French followers, added this notion that pointed out that it's the maximum. It's clear in Smith that it must be the maximum because the way he uses it, although he doesn't put it that way. But anyway, it's the maximum willingness to pay reservation value. Okay. Also, in the classical system, goods are discrete. You see, and if you think about it, they're looking out there in the world and they see people, consumers buying discrete bundles of goods that they take home. And well, go to the supermarket, look in your shopping basket, look in your neighbor's shopping basket. What do you see? You see a pound of bacon, a quart of milk, a jar of olives. You see a box of cornflakes or Wheaties. People are buying discrete single units of items, occasionally maybe a second or third, depending upon whether you're shopping for a family or not. But people buy discrete goods. So to Smith and to the classicals, it was kind of natural to think of demand in those terms. And so what is Smith's articulation of the dynamics of price discovery? Well, he says if the quantity brought to market falls short of effectual demand, in other words, too little is brought to market, those willing to pay the supply price cannot be supplied, and some will bid for what they can get, and price will increase. Notice he says that purchases are limited by supply if too little is brought to market, and the price tends to rise. On the other hand, if the quantity brought exceeds the demand, it can all be sold to buyers willing to pay the supply price, and price falls. So if too much is brought to market, sales will be limited by demand and price will tend to fall. Now that gives you a quantitative statement about that's easy to mathematize. So first, price change will have the same sign as excess demand. That's what Smith is telling us. And secondly, at any price, the contracted quantity is limited by the minimum of the amount demanded and supplied. So both of these are quantitative statements that are easily to render in mathematical form. So, all right, there's three elements in the classical theory of modeling of price discovery and markets. The first is that buyers come to market with maximum willingness to pay and a desire to buy cheap. Sellers come to market with a minimum willingness to accept and they desire to sell dear. So that's the motivation as we find it in Book 1, Chapter 7. And then secondly, what's the price adjustment rule? Well, price change and excess demand, and suppose we write excess demand as a function of P, they have the same sign. So if we imagine this continuous so that we can take derivatives, we don't have to do that, but if we take the modern view and apply the calculus here, it means that E of P times dP dt is strictly positive. That's unless the excess demand is zero. So that assumes that excess demand is not equal to zero. So price moves if excess demand is not zero. And then I want to introduce a function, V of P, and if you look at my original 1962 paper, I introduced this function. What I didn't understand at the time was its full significance. Now, V of P is the integral of excess supply, okay? You can think of it as the profit required to sustain any particular price, okay? And if you take the derivative of that, you get the statement that excess supply, the product of excess supply and the change in price is not positive. So in other words, V of T, this function is non-increasing. And you can write it for discrete values and costs, which is actually the more fundamental way to think about it. So V of P is just the sum over the profits made by potential profit to buyers based upon only those values which are strictly greater than the price in the market, plus then the sum over all those costs which are profitable to the sellers, which means they're below the price they find in the market. So price, you see, is we can think of price as balancing, you see, those outcomes. So V here, think of V as the overall weighted distance between price and the trader's valuations, their reservation value. So V of P here is a measure of distance in profit space. Now, you have this huge literature, starting with general equilibrium work of Walras, in which is relating to price changes to excess supply. Okay, none of that is in this model of Adam Smith. He's looking at the profits. He's looking at what happens to the profits of individuals. And I captured that with this V of P function. Now but I didn't see the connection with Smith at the time. You see, at the time, I saw this as just a better empirical explanation of price movements. And I did about 12 experiments, 14, something like that, that I reported in that original paper. And I found that this what I called excess rent was a better predictor of the changes in prices than excess supply, the raising. So I was only seeing it as a better empirical way to summarize the data. But with my co-author now, and he's the one who's brought this wisdom to the table and gotten me interested in it. To my co-author, you see, this leads to what we call the principle of maximum information. The market price evolves so as to reflect value better and better, and that's a consequence of the simple outcome that the change in value with regard to transactions is never positive. So it always tends to do better and better. And this, to me, you see, builds the bridge from Adam Smith to the modern work that you have with Hayek, and also the Hurwitz-Radner work on informational efficiency. So the information content, and we're actually, in our book, we relate that to measures of information that are available in the theory of information. So here's a summary based on the assumption of a large market. Here is an exponentially distributed values, giving you a demand function. Here's an exponentially distributed supply distribution of costs, giving you the supply function. And over here we have the V of P function being charted, which is minimum at the center of value for the market. Over here, you see you have short side rationing. If the price is low, then demand is limited by supply. If the price is too high, supply is limited by what people are willing to purchase. And over here, we have this V of P function reaching a minimum at the center of value. And here's the overall surplus actually achieved by the subjects. And down here, across transactions, we have price moving toward the center of value. Okay, now let's look at the early experiments. And here's the first experiment I did. This is January 1956. And notice on the left, I put price on the vertical axis. That's a mistake. We all make that mistake. There's no prices in a supply and demand diagram. None. What you see in a supply and demand diagram are, first, the distribution of values, maximum willingness to pay values of buyers, and the distribution function of sellers' cost. These are distribution functions. They depend, and what's plotted over here is V and C, value and cost, okay, not prices. On the right, we have the prices actually found by the buyers and sellers in the market. They're finding the prices, and it's okay to plot prices over here. But there are no prices in a market until buyers and sellers find them, okay? And that's the basic flaw in neoclassical economics and modern economics. We're writing demand and supplies as a function of prices, and there can be no prices until people go to market. We tend to model them as homework exercises, okay? What do? You maximize utility subject to an income constraint, and you find these prices, you find corresponding prices, and you express optimal quantities as a function of those prices. That's not the way to approach the explanation of prices as they're formed in markets. You can't do it with that model. And this is basically why general equilibrium model failed and ended up decades later with proving in the Sonnenschein, Mantel, De Brugge work, proving that the general equilibrium model had no empirical consequences. It had no content. Well, it had no content because it didn't have anything going in, okay? And now
excuse me, Professor
Yes.
Smith, we have only 3 more minutes, I'm afraid.
Okay, then I will hurry along here. Let me just say that I looked at this original experiment, and I thought there was something wrong with the experiment. How can people find the equilibrium? This is completely contrary to everything we believed and thought was true in those days. And so then I did an asymmetric case because I thought that explained why I was getting these such good results. Well, it turns out you get it whether it's asymmetric or not. Okay, and then here is a modern, more recent, with high school graduates. And you see, we first have them trade and we get all the bids and offers and the sequence of contracts. Then we show them the supply and demand because this is part of a teaching exercise. So markets in which people try to do best for themselves collectively do best for all. We get the reverse, you see, of the proposition that comes out of our Smith model of our social interactions. Now, in the wealth of nations, property is necessary but not sufficient. Okay, he has property rights in the wealth of nations. He adds the propensity to trust, barter, and exchange, and that we can think of as coming right out of Beneficence Proposition 1. Smith doesn't make that connection, but I think it's reasonable to do it. And unlike modern views of justice, in the theory of moral sentiments, justice only means one thing: security from intentional injury. So how do you get more justice in Adam Smith's world? You hurt people less, okay? Less injury, more justice. It's not about the distribution of benefits to the population, and then justice now often involves distribution. No, in Adam Smith, that has to do with beneficence. That's not about justice. Okay, here is a summary which really just repeats what I began with and that I wanted you to be sure and get. More than don't read me. Don't read what Bart and I published and what Sabu and I are going to publish. Read these originals. That's what I want you to encourage to do, because they are loaded with testable propositions. Okay, and I'll leave you with one last bonus quote. Smith says, we're not half so anxious that our friends should adopt our friendships as they should adopt our enemies. Okay. Think of the politics of that. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much. This was so interesting with so much to take away. So Professor Smith, I applaud you, and we are very fortunate to have you here today, or here, wherever here is in the internet world. Thank you.